Maybe before I get started, I do want to also address the online crowd because I am actually pretty impressed that people are still sticking around and staying attentive and asking questions. I know how hard that can be. So thanks to the online crowd for sticking around. I really appreciate that. So um, I'm going to tell you a bit about our work on validation. It's joint work we did in Leiden, Utrecht, and Freiburg. But before I start, I want to tell you a short story because validation can be a bit of a vague topic. And I want to take you along on this presentation with me. And by showing a bit about how validation can go wrong, hopefully you'll get an understanding on how important this topic is and how perhaps you can do it right within your learning analytics solution. So it's a story about my own university. A camera system was installed a while ago to measure what students were doing, how they were using the lecture halls that we have, because we have limited space and we want to use that in an optimal way. It's not exactly a learning analytics system, but it's a system where there were some things that went wrong when validating this system. So why did it go wrong? That's a question that I asked myself, that we asked ourselves in Leiden as well, because a lot of the traditional validity criteria were satisfied. So the university did a lot of work to rigorously test this system. They showed it was a reliable system. They showed it was generalizable, that it worked in different contexts with different types of students. And they showed it was a relevant system. It was usable by the people that had to use it, and it had an impact on using our rooms optimally. So in all senses, a sort of nice system. But in the end, actually, staff and students were not so happy about this system. And the initial idea was that people were sort of caring about their privacy and didn't like the system because of that reason. So the university thought, let's do a privacy assessment and see whether we can still go on with this nice solution that we have in mind. So they did a privacy assessment and it indicated, yes, we can turn the system back on. So the problem was solved and we could turn the cameras back on and make optimal use of our rooms. Right? Well, you might know the answer by now. Wrong. So staff and students didn't feel like they were heard. They didn't feel like the system was trustworthy. It wasn't fair towards certain people. So actually the system was able to detect certain people and not others. Well, there are questions about fairness there. So in the end, the cameras actually had to be removed by the university after an open letter signed by over 400 students and staff. So this is not a story about me blaming my employer for doing things wrong. I think they actually did a lot of the logical steps that you would usually do in validating such a system and making sure it works. But they did apparently miss out on some things. And that raises some questions, like how could this have been prevented? Which validity criteria apparently did they not consider? And is there more to validity than the rigor and the relevance that the university did show? And obviously for us, it's a bit more relevant to think about this in a learning analytics context. So could this happen with my learning analytics solution, that I validate it in a certain sense but not in another, and that it eventually doesn't find use in practice because there are concerns that I didn't address? And sort of in a general sense, how can validation be done right? So that's what we looked into, validation in a learning analytics setting. So it's good to know that in the learning analytics setting, there's a couple of things we might want to take into account when we validate. So we need to recognize that each context is different. There aren't one-size-fits-all solutions, and our validation approach should sort of take that into account. It should address both quantitative and qualitative elements, because we're not educational data mining after all, so we need to also take into account things like student experience, and it needs to be tied to learning outcomes. We really want to show that our solution has an impact in real life. And what Gastrovic said last year is that we currently don't really use validity criteria that meet these requirements. So we have these requirements, we're not meeting them, but they left it as a bit of an open question which criteria exactly we're not using and which criteria we should be using. So since that's an open question, that's an interesting research question, and it's a research question of our paper. So the main one is obviously which criteria should be considered in such a contextualized strategy, a strategy that addresses all of these requirements. And we divided that into two sub-questions, one that focused on learning outcomes and one that focused on interpretivistic perspectives that recognize contextual differences. So that's a very complex sentence also for me to say, but it's worth explaining a bit more as well, because it's an important part of our paper. So what I mean by interpretivistic perspective ties a bit into epistemology, our theory of knowledge, and how we think about how we build knowledge, also within learning analytics. And that has a lot of importance for what types of validity criteria we might want to consider. So that's kind of the approach we took as well, that we looked at from an epistemological perspective at what criteria make sense in certain situations. And it hopefully helps to clarify by giving you a few of the contexts in which we considered this. So a first dimension in epistemology is our view on truth. So hopefully this doesn't surprise you, but there are different ways of thinking about truth. So we can think about a situation where we can and should work towards an objective truth. That's kind of one end of the spectrum. And the other end is that there is no objective truth, or at least not in a social context, and that we mainly should work on enriching our understanding. So those are two ends of a spectrum, and I think most learning analytics researchers will be somewhere in the middle, or at least not at an endpoint. But just having this one dimension doesn't allow us to, for example, distinguish between criteria that focus on learning outcomes and those that don't. So we need another dimension, and that's the knowledge source axis. So where are we sourcing our knowledge from? And that can be sourced from theoretical reasoning or from practical application. And again, I would think, or we posit, that most learning analytics researchers will be somewhere in between in this front. And with these two axes, what you get is a sort of quadrant. So in this earlier slide, you only saw the top two parts, which are rigor and relevance. Those are criteria you might want to consider. On the bottom half, you see interpretivistic criteria. So this is from a different type of epistemological standpoint. And there you have the sort of counterparts of trustworthiness and authenticity. There are more criteria than this. This is sort of an overview that we give within the paper, and I'll dive a bit deeper in a second. But it does raise some questions. So where, for example, for you, is your epistemology placed within this quadrant? Not everyone will be looking at this from the same perspective. Some people will find rigor a lot more relevant, and perhaps even your own view changes over research projects. In one project, you might be focused a bit more on rigor. In another, you might be focused a bit more on relevance, and hopefully sometimes you're also focused on those other aspects. And for us, the interesting question was, what does the overall picture look like for learning analytics research? So what we did is we conducted a systematic review. We used earlier work to sort of decide which validity criteria might be relevant, because again, we don't really have a very good sense of which ones we should be considering. And I show a few examples here also because it shows that the definitions of these terms aren't so black and white, and different researchers will consider these things in different ways depending on the paper they're working on, for example. So a concept like statistical validity can mean something like statistical significance. It can mean correlation in certain contexts. It can also mean robustness. I think personally that's actually a quite interesting area for future research, to get more clarity on what we mean when we use these concepts. It's not something that I'm working on, so go ahead and work on it yourself. Free research idea. So we did this review, and that led to sort of the following result. We called it the Learning Analytics Validation Assistant, where we plotted validity criteria based on this epistemology plane. And it's an assistant in the sense that if you know where your views are, you know which validity criteria you probably should be addressing within your research. And I will say not everyone will be in the same place, so not everyone will be addressing the same criteria. But it's also an assistant for us in the sense that it helps us to answer our research questions, because validity criteria that emphasize learning outcomes will be the ones that are sort of on the right of this graph, on the practice side. Things like usefulness, understandability, usability, but also things like meaningfulness and authenticity. And in the second research question we had on how we incorporate interpretivistic perspective. So one thing you see quite clearly in this figure is that we do this, but we don't do this a lot. So we focus a lot more on the positivistic side, on the sort of quantitative side, if you will. And that asks for a bit of a deep dive. For now, there's obviously a lot more insight in the paper itself, but I do want to explain a couple of things so that you get more insight in what you perhaps can take from this figure. So one criteria that's worth looking at is external validity. I say external validity. Most of you will know this as generalizability. out of the 27 papers we found that considered this criterion, actually most of them mentioned it as a limitation. So not as something that they were so happy that they had achieved, but it was a limitation. So it's not necessarily problematic in individual cases that you mention this as a limitation, but if as a field we always mention generalizability as a limitation, something for future work, the danger is that it becomes a bit of an afterthought and we don't actually create solutions that are generalizable, but we say that that's for future work. Another thing we notice is that a lot of papers discuss concepts like meaningfulness, but for example, of the 11 papers that consider this concept, only one conducted qualitative interviews with participants. Most asked basically, is it meaningful or not? And then it's a yes or no question. You can wonder whether meaningfulness, authenticity, fairness, these types of concepts can be assessed with purely quantitative methods. We think that's not really the case, or at least not in all situations. And we say there's more need for thick descriptions of educational experience, so more thorough understanding of the educational context we're working in. And that can help to understand these sort of interpretivistic validity criteria, but actually can also address this sort of issue with generalizability, because if you understand one context and you understand another context, then you also know how you could transfer between those contexts. That's also the term in the interpretivistic field for generalizability. It's called transferability. And I don't want to just be doom and gloom here, because I think there's actually a lot of nice possibilities for improving validation. And one of them is argument-based validation. So that's an approach where you build sort of successive arguments that address different criteria to make a case for the validity of your solution. And it's starting to see some use within the field, but I think it deserves more of our attention, because diverse validity criteria, as we saw in this figure, require diverse perspectives to address them, to see sort of what is the truth behind this figure sort of shows that idea. And what people say about argument-based validation is that it allows to recognize legitimately diverse arguments. And there's already extensions that focus on things like learning outcomes and fairness. So it's really something that's actually uniquely suited to learning analytics, in my opinion, at least. So definitely a very interesting area to explore. And that's also kind of the last point I want to make, that there's really a bright future for validation within learning analytics. I think it's something we can do a lot better, and we are starting to do a lot better. So there was a recent special issue on strengthening ties with the educational assessment field. They are the ones where argument-based validation comes from, and they have a lot of ideas on validation. So I think that's a really interesting thing to see. And also I think it's worth mentioning some of the papers at this conference this year that did this, I think, in a very nice way. So combining quantitative and qualitative methods in evaluation and validation. For example, qualitatively evaluating something like trust. I would say that's a nice thing, that we aren't just evaluating these things quantitatively. And I also saw a paper yesterday that had critical reflections on the differences that can result in our conclusions from quantitative and qualitative data. These types of reflections, I think, are very insightful, and that we can learn from them to improve our understanding of our solutions. So I want to conclude by saying that validation is not about closing the door to further discussion. You shouldn't end your validation by saying, I've now validated my solution. You cannot further critique it. It should be about opening the door to dialogue. It's something that's collaborative. You do it together with your stakeholders, for example. So think of this example in Leiden where that went wrong a bit. And our learning analytics validation assistant is a starting point. It's not set in stone. It's only a short paper that I'm presenting here. So we hope we can explore this research area together with you, and please do get in touch if you're interested in working together. Thank you, and I welcome any questions.
If you want to just read the questions here and answer them, that'd be great.
Okay, read and answer the questions. Okay.
Give you more jobs.
I know the use of cameras to assess student footfall was only an example, but anyone doing this in future might consider what they did at our MIT, which was to use heat sensors to judge when rooms were in use and how crowded they were. That's an interesting comment, because that's actually where the discussion is heading in our university. It's not perhaps super central to my presentation, but thanks for that question, and that is actually the system we're considering. Sorry? I don't mean I got the question. Can you say it one more time? Yeah, so it was a question about this initial example that I gave about the camera system, and that at other universities they use heat detection systems for this, so it's less privacy sensitive. Let me see. What would be the advice to a Dutch university that starts implementing learning analytics in order to avoid what happened with the light cameras? I think it's kind of this last thing as well, to always incorporate your stakeholders in this process from the start. I think that's a really good way to go about it. And also, I think hopefully that what we created is helpful in the sense that it tells you it's good to think about your view on knowledge, on what your solution should be doing before you start. Select the validity criteria you might want to address in your research and use that as a frame to see how do I want to sort of validate the solution that I'm developing. Obviously, keep developing your solutions, that's the most important thing, but thinking a bit beforehand about what you want to validate can help, I think, and that prevents also perhaps these issues with generalizability being a bit of an afterthought in research. I think that's the online questions that I see.
Any final questions about it? Let me, hold on, don't talk yet.
There's one more question. Yeah, I have the same question, so I'll just speak out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is also an online question. So I think like generalizability, the lack of generalizability, is that really a issue, or is that just a feature we should probably embrace? So for example, predictive modeling, should that be generalizable, or should that just be context specific? So I don't see, like, at least for my research, I don't see that as a problem. I see that as a promising sign of people being aware of generalizability isn't something we just take for granted.
Hold on one second. Did you want to add to that? Or? Okay. I'll be back. No, because this one is the only one that goes to the online.
Yeah, so I think this is actually a really important point that you're making. And I think what I would say is that if that's the case, then I would expect it to be mentioned a lot less in papers as well, because then I think it's not sort of fair to mention it as one of your limitations, and you should perhaps then think of other limitations that are true limitations to your research or that you want to address in future work. So that's what we saw in our review, that it's mentioned a lot as we want to address this in future work, or our current work isn't suited to be generalized currently. And if we really don't think that's a problem, that's fine, but then why are we mentioning it in all our papers?